Hi everyone, thanks for joining us and welcome to this Economic Outlook webinar from the New Zealand Chamber and ANZ. My name's Rachel Boyle, I'm the Executive Director at the New Zealand Chamber in Singapore. And one of the positives of the COVID-19 situation is that we've had to think a bit differently about how we deliver content. So it's definitely much easier to get two speakers in the room from different countries via webinar than it ever was in person. Today we'll be focusing on economic predictions for New Zealand and for Southeast Asia with two leading experts. Sharon Zollner is the Chief Economist for ANZ New Zealand and will give her insights on the New Zealand economy. Sharon was in Singapore in July last year, and those who attended her session will remember her in-depth analysis, which was delivered in a sharp and a witty way. Though the economic picture then wasn't particularly rosy, I'm sure we don't take that forecast now. Khoon Goh is the head of Asia Research at ANZ Singapore, and he'll give his insights on Singapore and Asia. When we last spoke to Khoon in early March, he spoke about a number of economic scenarios with an optimistic view that there could be recovery and pent-up demand in the market by June. I'm keen to hear the update. A bit of housekeeping. If you want to ask any questions during the session, there's a green Q&A button at the bottom of your screens, and we'll save all the questions until the end. So I'll now hand over to Sharon to focus on the New Zealand economy.
Now, unfortunately, I can't make it. Unfortunately, I can't make my slides jump neatly, so we'll have to scroll through them. But that's all right. We're used to some sort of technical issues in this brave new electronic world we're in. So first up, the good news. The New Zealand lockdown is working very well. In fact, today, in data that's not actually on this chart, we had just 5 cases today, and all of them could be linked very clearly to existing cases that we already know about. So, and you can see there, it's been rumbling along at low levels. Unfortunately, that is likely to continue. It's a lot easier to get down from high levels than it is to eliminate those last cases. It's because of asymptomatic cases and the like. Nonetheless, this is very solid progress, and we've also been making a lot of progress, well, so we're told, well, time will tell, but in getting the contact tracing system in place that we have to have in order to keep stamping out cases as they arise. We've also really scaled up testing. There's some alarming stories out there about the world running out of the chemicals needed to make the tests, which is going to be a bit of a problem potentially in future. But for now, we've got the testing and the contact tracing in place that's given the government the confidence to announce that 1 week from now, we will be moving out of level 4 lockdown to level 3. So for many people, such as me, that's not going to make any difference, except that I can now get burgers and pizzas takeaway. And food delivered to the door ready-made as opposed to just groceries. Online retailing will open up from just essential goods to anything you like. About 400,000 people will be able to go back to work, and they are allowed to send their children to school in order to do that. But everyone who can work from home or has some childcare arrangement that can be sorted out is encouraged, indeed instructed, to please stay at home and do distance learning for a while yet. So level 3 socially is not much different. We've still got to avoid our friends and stay in our bubbles, is the language that the PME has been using, which is bubble being pretty much the people that you live with. And now we're allowed to add a lonely old person or a nanny to that, but otherwise still stay in our little bubbles. So the level 3 is for initial 2 weeks. And then we'll see where we're at. So this, there's been a lot of confusion. This is the elimination strategy, but elimination doesn't mean eradication. It means getting cases down to such a low level that you can eliminate them as they arise, the whack-a-mole strategy. Eradication would be wonderful, but not at any cost. And I think the cost of this lockdown, like everywhere, has been enormous. And there's been a debate everywhere, of course, about the cost of the lockdown and whether, in fact, every life saved is costing an enormous amount of money compared to the amount of money we're willing to throw at saving lives through road safety or cancer treatments or anything else. And I think that probably is true, but nonetheless, I think it's also true that societies will not tolerate bodies in the street, which is essentially what you get if you let this thing rip. So if you take that as your baseline, then I think this go hard, go early strategy is the best, and it's been working really well. The government wants to be very, very sure that we're not going to backslide and need to go back into lockdown again, and that's a very good idea, because it would not only be a huge hit to confidence, it would also be an enormous hit to balance sheets. Essentially, this first lockdown is seeing the government debt skyrocket, but also firm debt as well, and even household debt to some extent, with some households needing to defer their mortgage payments and the like. Every time you up your debt, you leave yourself in a more vulnerable position. So we really, really only want to do this once. And so far the signs are good, actually. So hopefully those numbers will keep coming down. So, and the lockdown has been very harsh, so the debate has been pretty vigorous as well. My legend seems to have disappeared, but essentially New Zealand is the second set of bars there, in between Italy, which is the harshest, and the UK. So it's been a very stringent lockdown, and people have respected it, so you would hope that it would have worked. But I think that people are on board with it. All my legends have disappeared. Excellent. Okay, the percent of activity that can take place here. On the left we go 0 to 100, and underneath we've got level 4, which is the most restrictive, level 3, level 2, level 1. So essentially under level 4, about a third of the economy simply can't happen. Under level 3, it's more like 15 to 20%. So a decent step up in the activity that can happen. But of course, what can happen, what will happen is very different. It's not like we're setting the economy free to fly like it was before, even at level 1. We've basically got a depression, well, a recession at least, on our hands. And so job security is rubbish for a lot of people now, and they've got a lot of debt, so they will be pulling back on all discretionary spending, just as you always do in a recession. So, and house prices are likely to fall, we think 10 to 15%. So the bounce back will be incomplete even when the economy is unfettered. So here's another mystery chart. This is from our Business Outlook survey, what firms say about their own activity and their employment intention. So every indicator in our business survey is tanked, quite understandably. A net 28% of firms are already saying that they have cut jobs. So it's actually 40% have cut, 12% have got more staff than 1 year earlier. So over time, we would expect employment intentions to improve, but only because firms are moving into the bucket of having already taken that action of cutting staff. So we'll be keeping a close eye on that, but clearly the unemployment rate's going to rise. So it's not going to hit the economy evenly. People have to eat, so groceries have been having a good time. They'll actually take a hit, I think, from the fact that from a week from now we can all get our takeaways again and don't have to cook, but they've been doing rather well. They will continue to do better than baseline, of course, because restaurants, eating at restaurants is still a no-no. Agriculture's been continuing on largely as normal through the lockdown because they were deemed an essential business. And online retail from a week's time will be back in business. But of course, it'll be the big players that do fine, the ones that already had an online retail presence. It's the little quirky, interesting shops on the main street that are really going to struggle. Forestry's back in action a week from now too, and log prices are rising, and the big stockpiles that emerged as a result of China's slowdown in February are now have been largely worked through. So in that regard, the timing of the lockdown wasn't as bad as it could have been. So they're actually in a reasonable position to restart. Construction can get straight back into it. The social distancing measures they now have to implement will slow them down. And the same with meat processors. Their productivity is down probably 50%, but they can open and they can add extra shifts and they can work in the weekend and they can do what they need to do to get stuff done. So they're probably in the relative winners camp. Or the worst affected, obviously, tourism, and that's a big part of the New Zealand economy. And that's a big part of why we think the New Zealand economy is going to fall more than the developed economy average. Of the IMF is picking 6% for developed nations. We've got 8 to 10 for New Zealand, and that's partly because tourism is just non-existent in the international sense. You're not allowed to come. Education exports, similar boat, obviously. Accommodations being hit very hard by that. A third of New Zealand's hotels have shut. At the very low end, the government is putting homeless people in motels, so they're all right. But the rest of the sector is obviously really struggling. It'll bounce back a little bit when domestic travel comes back, and that could be relatively soon. Under level 2, essential travel will be, well, but the definition of essential will be broadened somewhat, but they'll still be discouraging people probably from going on holiday around the country for some time. Sport and entertainment clearly are going to be out for the count for a long time because that involves larger congregations of people, and hospitality is under the pump as well. And bricks and mortar retail probably be a permanent shift to online to some extent. So I don't know what's going to fill all those holes on main streets. It's going to be a real challenge. Commercial property. Now, we saw in the last recession in the GFC that a 30% fall peak to trough, which was roughly twice what housing did. And that's probably not a bad rule of thumb this time too. So particularly retail landlords, but also even office space, this whole working from home experiment, a bunch of firms will realise that, you know, at the ANZ call centre in New Zealand is now working from home. We never knew that was possible, and it was done incredibly fast, and productivity seems to be really good. Those sorts of changes will have a permanent element as well. Industrial property should hold up better with the likes of wholesaling, also just the move to online retailing is going to be more demand for warehouse space and the like. And the housing market is going to be affected as well. You can already see it in things like Google searches for mortgage calculator have dropped reasonably sharply. So we would typically, of course, the housing market's a lot more volatile than the GDP. So we've said 10 to 15% fall, but it could be bigger as those usual recession dynamics kick in, feedback loops from unemployment to spending to housing to retail to construction, and round we go. So we should, however, have a decent offset from our net exports. So essentially most of our exports are food, and this is the share going to China. You can't see the numbers, but basically everything's going up. So we've been putting a lot of eggs in one basket, and back in January, February, that looked like a really bad idea, and now suddenly it looks like a good idea again because China's economy is reopening, whereas others are still shutting down. So diversification wouldn't have helped actually, because this is every country of the world being affected by this. It's been encouraging to see our meat exporters be very nimble, moving between China and the US with our manufactured beef, for example, Chinese hot pots versus US burgers. And we're going to need to remain nimble. But the fact is, food's going to be in demand this year. There's going to be food security issues in a bunch of countries. And so governments will be prioritising food imports. I'm sorry, I seem to be flashing suddenly. Never mind. So here are our forecasts, which again are mysterious, but on the left there, GDP growth, we've got it falling 22% in Q2 and bouncing back. It looks like that's a spreadsheet error, so it's more useful to look at it in level terms. So you can see a very sharp fall, a partial bounce back, and then a slow haul back, and some of that damage is permanent. So firms that don't make it, for example, tourism being out for the count for longer, and resources needing to shift into other industries, that takes time. So scarring that lasts quite a while. We're not bouncing straight back to business as usual, and that's a phenomenon everyone's going to be dealing with. House price inflation, that trough there is -15, but you can see it is a pretty V-shaped bounce back. We do have shortages of housing. We're discovering that some towns, a surprisingly large proportion of housing was actually being used to house tourists with Airbnb. So places like Queenstown are obviously going to bear the brunt of that. Something like every second house that's been built in recent years has had a little Airbnb unit, which made a lot of sense at the time, but now just represents extra debt that isn't generating any income. So that housing market's going to really feel it, I think. And the unemployment rate, it jumps very sharply to a peak of about 11 and then comes off slowly. So you can see there that it's a much faster rise in unemployment than you would normally get, because this has not been a usual slide into recession. It's been a sudden stop. That's global phenomenon too. The US numbers are even freakier. So our relative strengths and weaknesses, people have to eat, as I said, even in lockdown. They might not be eating Wagyu beef and venison, of course. So there will be a price hit. Some of our more price sensitive luxury items will have to meet the market. And low fiscal debt starting point, not going to be a low end point, that's for sure, but it does give us more options than other countries, particularly the Euro area, for example, is going to really struggle with the politics of that. Our dependence on China, is it a strength or a weakness? Time will tell. Our natural border and our early lockdown means we are in in the enviable position of knowing if we get this under control, it's not going to sneak in through our borders. It can't. We maintain strong border quarantines and closed borders as long as we need to. We can be very confident of keeping it out, which is something other countries really are going to continue to struggle with. Weaknesses, as I mentioned, the dependence on tourism. Household debt has crept up back to where it was in 2007. And so what we saw there is that households all suddenly simultaneously freaked out about the size of their mortgage and saved a lot more. Saving more sounds good, but it means spending less. And so that's tough on retail and hospitality and the jobs of the people who work in those sectors. And it takes a while. So the person on the street, it felt for them like the recession was 3 or 4 years long, and you'd expect similar deleveraging dynamics this time. And drought, it's a hat trick. The Asian financial crisis of '98, the global financial crisis of 2008, and now the COVID-19 crisis of 2020. Every time we get some hideous global shock, we also seem to have a drought. And so that will hit dairy volumes and meat volumes. It's very unfortunate, actually, more for the meat sector than dairy. Cull animals need to be sent to the works, but the works are running at low capacity. So it's a bit of double pressure there that's pretty challenging to deal with. But yeah, overall, I just keep reminding ourselves that other countries have worse problems than we do. Here's the mix of growth, which is another mystery, but the light blue there is consumption. It's the largest part of the economy, and it's obviously being hit hard. The yellow negative there is investment. The darker blue positive is net exports. So you can see it doesn't exactly save the day, but it is a positive. And the orange there is your government contribution from what they're going to do, which is everything they can think of. Essentially, any project you've got ready, shovel ready, they're interested. So there's sort of 3 phases. There's the fiscal rescue, which is happening now. There's the what have you got to keep people busy immediately part, and then there's the longer term. How can we best address our infrastructure deficit and do projects that are really going to make a difference to New Zealand in the long run? This chart, the orange line there is the world price of New Zealand's commodities. The blue line is global soft commodities, and the dark line at the bottom is global hard commodities. So you can see that for years, a mysterious number of years, we've actually been outperforming for quite some time, actually. And we do expect that to continue. Of course, the oil price was spectacular overnight with the contract for May delivery. It was the last day of trading for that contract. So it was one giant game of hot potato. And by the end of trading, you had to pay someone $35.62 to take that barrel of oil off your hands. So that's just remarkable. I think the percent change for the day was minus 306%. So obviously that's just a bit of a technical oddity. The oil price for June delivery was $20. Positive $20, but nonetheless it does show you that hard commodities are under a huge amount of pressure. Essentially the fear in the oil markets is that in May there will be nowhere to put that oil. Essentially everything's filling up pretty fast. So our commodity prices will fall, but less than most. Here's the fiscal outlook. The dark line's obviously the new one, and the orange line's the old one. So a lot of debt, taking our net debt back basically to its peaks, its recent peaks. And of course, we've had a pretty massive earthquake in that time, as well as a global financial recession. So we do see net doubling from 20 to 40 or 50%. That means you've got to sell a lot of bonds, and the Reserve Bank stepping up with quantitative easing. This is the first time that we've had this in New Zealand. They started off with a $30 billion bid, which seemed enormous at the time, surprised everyone on the upside, just like the first fiscal package. And just like the first fiscal package, it's now looking a bit light. So we see it doubling and maybe then some, in order to basically keep pace with our best estimate of how much debt the government's going to have to issue. So essentially they're trying to avoid the long interest rates going up. And because of the sheer volume of bonds that the government has to sell. We think they'll manage, but we think they'll have to throw the kitchen sink at it. One day, of course, all this debt has to be paid back, but that remains a problem for another day. But when we do get around to that point, a whole lot of sacred cows are going to be on the chopping block, like capital gains tax, wealth taxes, higher taxes for that matter, just generally, raising the super age, which is 65 and universal and not means tested and outrageously expensive, and it's a pay-as-you-go system. So today's millennials are paying for the baby boomers, and they're also the ones who are being left with this massive legacy of debt to save the old people, essentially. So there's huge issues of intergenerational fairness that are going to have to be addressed. And young people need to start voting, really. Tell every young person you know to start voting. So there's the scale of our QE estimate. It puts us about where the Federal Reserve was after the GFC, basically. So that's the scale of it. We're not going to catch them, though, because they're off and racing. They're buying junk bonds. So we're sticking to the mainstream, unconventional policy in terms of buying government or quasi or local government debt, whereas the Fed has crossed the Rubicon. Global equities, that darkest line there, that's the top one, that's the New Zealand share market. The light blue one is the US share market. So they're back about where they were a year ago. Is the outlook for company earnings in the next 12 months what it was 12 months ago? I would say no. But equities have boomed from the central banks throwing money around, and it has to go somewhere. But it does look a little vulnerable to a correction, in my opinion. Because the fundamentals are very weak in terms of this is not going to be a V-shaped recovery. So key questions, there's heaps of them, but will a vaccine be developed? That we're all assuming that's a given, but it's actually not, though people are sounding optimistic. When will it come and how long will it take to roll out? What if New Zealand does eradicate the virus? No one else does, and then there's no vaccine. So what do we do? Leave our borders closed forever? Interesting question, so sort of philosophically at least. Will level 3 prove stringent enough to lock in the progress we've made in getting the cases down to a level where we're confident we can keep stomping them out? And can we avoid going back into level 4? What will our trade patterns look like? Which countries are going to deal with this well and which ones are dealing with it badly? I think most people would put the US into the latter camp, unfortunately. Huge pressure to exit their lockdowns earlier than the health experts recommend. Which would suggest that unless they're going to be willing to tolerate huge numbers of deaths, that they're going to oscillate and go back into a lockdown, possibly broader lockdowns than they've had so far. So I'm not wildly optimistic on the US outlook. And finally, will all this newly printed money end in an inflationary fireball? Not anytime soon, one would have to say, because this is a hugely deflationary shock. Look at oil, for example, and all the pricing indicators in our business survey have absolutely tanked. But somewhere down the track, you know, some politician's going to say, I can make all this debt go away. Who needs austerity? So I don't know when that day will come or how things might evolve, but it would seem to me that inflation targeting was introduced by politicians in response to a public that was sick to death of inflation, and that's not today's problem. And politicians, if they want to get elected, respond to the needs and concerns of the population, the voting population of the time. So that's just something to bear in mind for somewhere down the track. If inflation expectations were to take off, then central banks have got nothing. That could be an interesting time. I'll leave it there because I think I've taken more than my fair share. I'll stop sharing my slides. There we go. And mute myself. Over to you, Khoon.
Thank you very much, Sharon. So for my part, I'm just going to quickly go through a view on the Singapore economy and the broader Asian region as well. Since the last time I spoke, much has changed. Unfortunately, in the context of Singapore, it hasn't been a rapid improvement in the outbreak as New Zealand has experienced. In fact, in Singapore, it's gone the other way, where the outbreak initially being seen as contained has actually continued to deteriorate. And yesterday, Singapore new cases at over 1,400. The majority of the outbreak is occurring in foreign worker dormitory clusters. And what we know from this virus is when you have a lot of people within close proximity of each other, it's just a ripe environment for the virus to take hold. And this situation suggests that we can anticipate much higher numbers to come in the coming days. Now, these dormitories, at last count, I think there were 11 dormitories have been gazetted as isolation areas. But within those dormitories, you can imagine how the numbers can continue to spread despite the best efforts by the authorities to try and segregate and isolate those infected from those that are not. So the bottom line is this for Singapore. We are in circuit breaker mode at the moment. The government doesn't like to use the word lockdown, but for all effective purposes, that is what the country is under at the moment. And it's hard to see the circuit breaker measures being eased anytime soon. There's also another factor we need to consider in the Singapore context as well, in that these foreign workers actually play a very important role in the Singapore economy, particularly in the construction sector, manufacturing sector, some parts of hospitality. And if you have huge chunks of the foreign worker population effectively under extended isolation or quarantine, that means that those sectors of the economy will not be coming back into normalcy or back into normal activity mode anytime soon. So that's something to consider, which I'll touch on later on. So this is the picture in Singapore. Now, across the rest of the Asian region, there are some bright spots starting to emerge. Singapore, as you can see, now has the highest number of cases in Southeast Asia. And if you adjust for population, I think the numbers are even staggeringly higher. There are some countries that are starting to get their numbers under control. Thailand and Malaysia, for example, have started to see their active case counts decline. So they are actually starting to flatten that famous curve. And Thailand will start to ease off on some of their restrictions fairly soon. You can see Taiwan and Vietnam down right at the bottom have really been doing quite well in managing the outbreak. And as a result, they have not been faced with as severe restrictions domestically. And they are actually in quite a good position to ease back on whatever restrictions that they have put in place so far. I think the other countries that are seeing their case numbers continuing to rise and certainly warrant very close attention is Indonesia and India. You can see India's cases continue to move higher. This is despite the country going into very strict lockdown mode. And I guess it's a simple question of the fact that huge population, huge density, and even in lockdown, we have to remember that in India, lockdown for a lot of people means being stuck at home with your extended family. So lots of people cramped together in your house or living quarters, which actually could result in a much bigger spread than what lockdown means in more developed economies. So we are starting to see the numbers in India continuing to rise, which means their lockdown will most likely continue to be extended as well. And Indonesia, at this point in time, the cases continue to rise. I think there are concerns about potential underreporting and the reluctance by the government in Indonesia to impose stricter lockdown measures as well is not helping. So we are seeing quite a huge divergence in how the COVID-19 outbreak is progressing within the region, which means there's going to be quite large differences in when restrictions can be eased and therefore how those different economies could potentially recover. Now, again, as when I spoke to you all last, I introduced a very simple framework for thinking about how we look at and estimate the potential economic impact on each individual economy. Given that things have shifted quite materially, I had to rethink and change the framework a little bit. The main idea is still there, it's just that now we have to introduce a hard fourth channel, which is basically lockdown. So the way we look at it and the way we think about how economies are getting impacted. You still have the two traditional channels, which is your international travel restrictions, which was the sector that was hit the hardest, and effectively now have ground to a halt. You have reduced external demand, which initially in the month of February was largely concentrated around reduced demand from China. But now, of course, with the lockdown getting extended to large parts of the global economy, we are starting to see now massive reduced external demand from everywhere else. But if there is a gray lining, is that with China now starting to get back into recovery mode, at least we will see some pickup in Chinese demand. Won't be enough to offset what's happening in the rest of the world, but at least not everything is going in one direction. We have of course, the indirect impacts, confidence spillover effects, and then of course the lockdown. And the way we look at it at the moment, depending on the economies and how strict their respective lockdown measures are, that channel could potentially be the biggest source of contraction in economic activity compared to the others. So let's quickly just run through for the region how important each of these channels are in terms of importance to the economy, because they'll give us an idea of where most of the impact on growth is going to come from. And also when it comes to thinking about how quickly things can recover, this will also help us to have a rough idea of which sectors and how quickly any potential recovery will be. We look at tourism, for example. The first column on the left there is travel services, or how important tourism is to each of the individual economies in this region. You can see Singapore there. Tourism is important, but not as important as it is for countries like Thailand or Hong Kong, for example. So tourism is around 5.5% of GDP for Singapore, but Thailand is over 10%. And we know tourism has basically ground to a halt because of the travel ban. So that is the full impact of that hitting home. So Thailand definitely is faring the worst from a tourism channel point of view. Singapore obviously not immune, and we have seen the impact of that, particularly on Singapore Airlines on the hospitality segment. But interestingly enough, for the hotel and accommodation sector, they are not faring as bad as other sectors, mainly because the government has utilized hotels to put people under stay-home notice or quarantine, those travelers coming back into Singapore, residents and Singapore citizens. So that's actually helping to shore up hotel occupancy rates, helping to offset the lost business from tourism. Of course, that's only one segment that has managed to see government response helping. For the vast majority of other enterprises that are exposed to tourism, they are not getting such assistance, unfortunately. Now, in terms of the economies that are least exposed to tourism, you can see down at the bottom, India and China will not be hit the most, given the low reliance on tourism. Now, the middle column is how important exports are, merchandise goods exports, in terms of a share of GDP. Again, this will tell us which economies are most exposed to the downturn in global trade, with huge chunks of the global economy shut down. Singapore, we know, is actually very reliant on exports, being a small open economy. The domestic market is way too small, so exports is very, very important. But yet, if you compare in the region, exports is not as important in Singapore compared to other economies. Vietnam, Malaysia, Taiwan, Thailand actually has exports as a bigger share of GDP than Singapore. So again, in terms of the global trade impact, Singapore will be hit, but not as bad as some of these other economies. At the other end of the spectrum, India and Hong Kong is not going to be as badly impacted from the global contraction in trade. Again, that's due to the structure of their economy. India largely reliant on their own huge domestic economy, and Hong Kong is actually largely reliant on business with China. A lot of the trade is actually just re-exports. If you strip that out, actual trade value add is actually very, very small. Now, when it comes to household consumption, this is critical because this is where the lockdown channel really will hit home quite differently for individual economies. So when you put your country in lockdown, effectively you're destroying domestic demand. Domestic demand basically grinds to a halt. So economies that are hugely dependent on domestic demand will actually fare worse from being put in a state of lockdown. And this is where Singapore, as you can see, household consumption as a share of GDP is actually the lowest in the region. So from that point of view, yes, the lockdown circuit breaker measures definitely will have a material bearing on economic activity. We're seeing it everywhere, shopping malls closed, etc. But in terms of the sheer magnitude of the impact, it's not as severe compared to places like Philippines, for example, where Luzon province, where Manila is, the largest economic center for the Philippines, in lockdown. And because the Philippines actually has a huge reliance on household consumption, as you can see there, almost 86% of GDP, that's actually going to have a much bigger material impact on their economy compared to Singapore. And you can look down the list there, countries that have imposed lockdown. India, for example, that lockdown is going to be very, very damaging economically for their economy, with household consumption at 70% of GDP, and similarly for Malaysia as well. Now, when we look at the indicators so far, we've had Q1 GDP coming up from China already, and it showed massive contraction in Q1 growth. First time that Chinese GDP growth has gone into negative territory in 3 decades. But some of the forward indicators do tell us that Q1 will probably be the low point in terms of Chinese growth. That's because the bulk of the damage in terms of the Chinese economy occurred over the month of February. That's when huge parts of their country went into lockdown. But restrictions started to ease off from about middle of March. And we've seen some of the activity indicators starting to pick up. And if you look at the monthly data, March actually started to show improvement, and the PMI has shown a very, very strong rebound, as you can see there from the light blue line. We think activity managed to at least hold on to some of the rebound into April. So that to us suggests that we will see a bit of a recovery in the current quarter, the second quarter in Chinese activity. Now, of course, with restrictions easing, with factories restarting, production getting back on track, that is helpful, but Chinese activity is going to be hit by weakening external demand with Europe and the US basically shut. So the rebound that we are anticipating in the second quarter, it will not be as strong. I think it's going to be tentative, but at least it's going in the right direction. Contrast that to Singapore, and what you're going to see increasingly throughout the rest of the region is that the first quarter was pretty bad. In the context of Singapore, you can see there the contraction in economic activity in Q1 was the worst since the global financial crisis. This Q1 will not be the low point, unfortunately. The first quarter contraction is largely the impact from tourism and China shutting down. But this current quarter will be the impact of the global lockdown plus any domestic restrictive measures that have been imposed. So in the case of Singapore, with the circuit breaker measures coming in, that's going to exert a huge impact on second quarter growth, which means that this current quarter will be far worse than what we've seen in the first quarter. So the bottom in economic activity is basically happening right at this moment in the current quarter, and the recovery is likely going to be from the third quarter and the fourth quarter onwards. Now again, how quickly we can get that recovery will depend on when the circuit breaker measures or lockdown restrictions get eased off. I mentioned earlier, we have started to see indications, for example, Thailand, they're in a good position to start easing back on some of their restrictions. Malaysia has extended theirs. Singapore, I can't really see the restrictions getting lifted on the 4th of May as initially hoped. And other countries, again, will depend on how their virus outbreak plays out. So what we know for sure is that in terms of the current quarter, the month of April is pretty much a write-off. Huge chunks of activity in this region basically put into lockdown. What we can hope optimistically is that perhaps we start to see some restrictions ease off in May, and that's basically an optimistic scenario. And any restrictions that will ease off will most likely only be very gradual and tentative. That will help to maybe spur a little bit of domestic demand activity, but in terms of foreign travel, those will stay in place for quite some time. And again, the impact from the reduction in external trade is still going to be felt as the quarter progresses, unfortunately. So that's why I feel that the current quarter we're going to be in for a lot more pain, and that the second quarter contraction will be far worse than the first quarter. And just to give you a sense of the magnitude, and increasingly we're going to see a lot more of these where the indicators coming up are just quite staggering in terms of the magnitude of the declines. In many cases, we have to start adjusting the axis on our graphs just to accommodate the sheer declines. But this gives you an example. This is the number of passenger movements going through Changi Airport. We know SARS was pretty bad, but this is just magnitudes worse. The sheer collapse in the number of passenger movements through Changi Airport is something we've never seen before, and this is the data up to March. And it's a similar picture as well for global trade. Now, I mentioned earlier, with large parts of the global economy going to shut down, that's obviously going to have an impact on global trade activity. With the global economy going into recession, demand for a lot of the normal goods, products will just not be there. People still got to eat, right? So this is where New Zealand is lucky. Demand for food will still be there, but the demand for anything else will be severely reduced. So this is a chart of world trade volumes versus an indicator that I track quite closely. This is based on the number of container vessels that are moving around the world, carrying containers and the like. So that's an indication of how much trade activity there is. So the more vessels are moving around, getting busy, that indicates that trade activity is pretty active. When you have large numbers of vessels basically not moving, staying idle, that's a sure sign that demand has collapsed and global trade is going down. So what we can see right here, right now, is that the number of vessels moving around has declined and the number of vessels staying idle has basically increased. And the net result of that is that we haven't seen this little level of shipping activity since the global financial crisis. And that's telling us global trade volumes is set to basically decline very, very sharply in the coming months. Again, that shouldn't surprise any of us. But again, some of these indicators are just giving us an inkling of the kind of magnitudes of contraction and decline that we should expect going forward. And today, South Korea reported their export numbers for the first 20 days of April, down 26%, worse since, you guessed it, global financial crisis. So again, this clearly will have bigger implications for economies that are trade dependent. But to be honest, no one will be immune in this region. And finally, just a last slide. This chart here shows the IMF's latest Asian growth forecast for 2020 in what they call the Great Lockdown. I just call it the GL. And how it compares to the previous two last crisis periods that Asia has experienced. The first one was the Asian financial crisis, 1997-98. And then, of course, we had the global financial crisis in 2008 and 2009. And what you can see here is that for a lot of the economies in the region, we are expecting a much larger contraction in economic activity than what was seen during the global financial crisis. For some of them, it will be as bad as the Asian financial crisis, but thankfully not all. I think the key difference between what we are going through now and the Asian financial crisis, for example, is during the Asian financial crisis, it was a genuine banking sector, a genuine financial crisis, which tends to have a much more material impact on the respective economies. This time around, the economic shock we're seeing is quite different. We're hoping it doesn't turn into a genuine banking crisis, of course, but most of the impact is largely through the traditional channels, as I've outlined earlier: tourism, trade, domestic demand, basically getting destroyed because of lockdown measures. I'm showcasing the IMS numbers because obviously we outlined our forecast a month or so back, and because things have moved quite rapidly, obviously our forecasts are now out of date. I think the IMS one is probably the most up-to-date one at this particular point in time, and even the IMS one, looking at it now, probably feels like it's still a little bit on the optimistic side, given what we know. We are most likely to see much larger contractions by the time we are done with it. So that's it from me. Thanks very much for your attention, and we'll move down to the Q&A session.
All right. Since Rachel isn't speaking, we'll just moderate our own questions. Khoon, would you like to take this one? What does this mean for globalization long term?
I think what this means is that we have already started to see a slight retreat in globalization when the US-China trade war started. And that was when a lot of the US, for example, was starting to question the reliance on having so much of global production being made in China, and of course the national security implications behind that. And we actually started to see a lot of companies shift production out from China into other countries like Vietnam, for example, or even India, or bringing it closer back to the US, like Mexico benefited quite clearly from that. I think as a result of what's going on here, I think the world's going to look very different, particularly in Asia. I think what we'll see is things like security of supply, the thought process that maybe countries need to be less reliant, more internally reliant, for security reasons will probably continue to take precedent. That means we'll probably see further, I guess, unwinding or dialing back of globalization. But I think, we won't exactly go back to a world of autarky. I think we are a very globally connected world now, and we won't really go all the way back. But it's just at the margins where, for things like production, manufacturing production in particular, even food production, things like that, I can see more of dialing back a little bit of that happening. And I think we will start to see that reflected in terms of longer term FDI flows in the region, where you probably see less going into China, more going to other places just to diversify, even more back into the key home markets.
It'll be interesting to see what happens with food, because on the one hand, a lot of countries are worried about food security anyway, and this episode won't have done anything to decrease those fears, but some countries simply can't feed themselves, essentially, and climate change is going to make a lot more countries fall into that basket. So it's going to be interesting to see how it pans out for New Zealand, but I do suspect that the medium-term outlook for exports of food is actually pretty reasonable, because Australia is potentially even going to be needing more of New Zealand's food going forward, depending on how climate change pans out. So that might be an exception to the rule, but generally speaking, many countries are very reluctant to reduce tariffs on their domestic food production. So it's going to be a really interesting environment going forward.
Yes. So here's one question for you, Sharon. Question here is that you put up some unemployment figures of your projections for New Zealand, showing it heading into double-digit growth and then coming back down. So the question is, are the unemployment figures a true measure of unemployment? Are those who are not currently working but have a job, go back after the lockdown, counted as unemployed?
It's going to be interesting because, there's just measurement issues right at the moment. If you're locked in your house, are you available for work? So, Stats New Zealand has sort of pointed out that they'll try and maintain the usual definition of if you were available for doing a job that you could do from home, then you are in the labour force. New Zealand has a historically high labour force participation rate at the moment, and we've had a very low unemployment rate regardless. And also despite very, very strong growth in immigration. So the starting point for the labour market is much, much tighter than, say, Australia's, where their unemployment rate is higher despite a lower participation rate. And also they've had much more casualisation of the workforce over there, huge growth in part-time employment, whereas New Zealand hasn't had that. So it's actually been quite different. But of course, the starting point only gets you so far when the picture changes as dramatically as it has at the moment. And I would unfortunately see upside risks to those unemployment numbers, just given the sheer number of firms in our business outlook survey who are saying they're laying people off already. But, I just read an article that Domino's Pizza is hiring 1,000 people because they're expecting an explosion in pizza demand when they can start delivering again next week. All right, I'm going to give you the hard question. Are we facing another global financial crisis, Khoon?
Not financial, but a crisis, definitely. And let's hope it doesn't dwarf into a financial crisis. I think one key reason why we can avoid a financial crisis this time around is that I've been heartened by the response by policymakers, not only just central banks, but also governments as well. I think they've already learned a lesson from previous crises. And in previous crisis, they were criticized for being too timid early on. I think this time around, they recognized how severe things were, and they really threw the kitchen sink at it. From New Zealand to Singapore to even the US, everywhere else, we are seeing unprecedented amounts of stimulus. The Fed embarking on unlimited QE. So I believe that will help prevent what's happening now from turning into a financial crisis. But of course, the economic cost of what we're going through, what the IMF terms the Great Lockdown, is still going to leave the global economy in the worst state since the Great Depression. Financial crisis, no, but very, very deep recession, unfortunately, yes.
Okay, my video seems to be working again now. Another question here. I'll put it out to either of you actually. Can we expect the rest of the world to follow the China recovery path?
I have to say the China recovery path isn't all that clear just yet. You know, it looked like they were totally on top of it, and now they are also experiencing the threat of a second wave as well. So given they are a couple of months ahead of everyone else, I think we do need to watch very closely what happens there and learn lessons from it and use that information to try and optimize our own responses. New Zealand's in a better position to do that, of course, because the virus arrived relatively late on our shores, and we're still, I guess you could argue, at the very, very early stages of it, and hopefully we won't go any further. But yeah, I do think it'll be important to keep an eye on what happens in China, and it is notable that you know, their economy's not back to business as usual, and it's been months now. Khoon, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, so I think China will give us obviously I guess a bit of a wave forward in what can happen when you ease back restrictions. Chinese authorities have been very measured, of course, in the way they open things up. They haven't opened everything up all at once. It has obviously been in stages, and in areas where they have noticed renewed outbreak, as Sharon mentioned. This is largely towards the north of China, where you had the Chinese-Russian border, where new infection cases were actually from Chinese citizens returning from Russia. They very quickly then closed off the border again. So I think one lesson we'll learn is be measured, be cautious in opening up, but be prepared to reinstate them the moment you see renewed outbreaks. So I think what this means is there's going to be fits and starts when it comes to this. So obviously China will be first. We'll see how the New Zealand experience will be. I'm sure everybody will be learning how New Zealand's situation will progress in the coming weeks.
Okay, I'm just trying to coordinate these questions so we stay in similar topics. One here, with supply chain disrupted and dwindling domestic resources and food crisis in a number of countries, what are the chances of war or conflict between countries? Curly one for you both.
I just say both a plummeting oil price and a sharply higher food prices are both terrible for geopolitical stability. History shows that, and I don't see why this time's going to be any different. And obviously tensions between the US and China are something the whole world keeps a very nervous eye on, and they seem to be rising at the moment, I would suggest. Khoon, you want to add anything to that?
Not really. I'm not a geopolitical expert, so I don't opinion on that.
Hope for the best.
Yeah. And a question here around ASEAN. So what are the logical next steps or the direction of travel within ASEAN AEC integration? So Singapore's Prime Minister has recently called for greater efforts to work together. What do you think will happen there? Khoon, one for you.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting and tricky, right? Because countries have taken the unprecedented step of shutting down borders. And any progress in restarting, I think, will require coordinated efforts. But also you need to be sure that other countries are really up to it in terms of containing the outbreak domestically as well. So I think part of this cooperation and all that is actually coming towards a common set of monitoring, testing, screening people whenever we start to see international travel getting lifted, for example. You know, we're still far away from that at this particular point in time, but I think it's definitely useful to put in place common standards. So I can see a situation where in future, the way we go about travel will be fundamentally different, just in a similar way as how after 9/11, security got stepped up and all of us had to deal with long queues and, you know, security and, you know, nasty TSO personnel. I think in the post-COVID environment, it's going to be something similar where we just have to adapt. There'll be new screening procedures, new things like this that will put in place to allow travel again. whilst ensuring that we don't have renewed outbreak of viruses getting transmitted across border.
And following on from that, what do travel restrictions mean for migration? So kind of longer term people flows to both New Zealand and to Singapore. So both our countries rely on migration of people.
Well, in New Zealand, it's gone to zero at the moment, but over time, I think the border will open again, but probably with a 14 to 20-day quarantine period. You could even allow a little bit of luxury tourism. You can go and stay in a luxury resort on, far away from anyone else with your meals delivered. Wouldn't be a bad idea, a bad prospect, I suppose. So I think the flow of New Zealanders matters a lot as well. There's a lot of New Zealanders in Australia, for example, but it looks like New Zealand and Australia are both getting on top of things. If that were different, if there were a lot more personal freedoms in New Zealand, for example, than in Australia, I think you could see quite a lot of people coming to New Zealand. But as it is, it looks like we're both maybe even be able to be in the same bubble before too long, which would be a great outcome. So I think net migration will fall a lot, but a large part of that is simply just that the labour market's going to be weak, and so then it's going to be very much jobs for New Zealanders first, and there'll be a real strong public sense that if you've got a job, you really should do your utmost to give it to a New Zealander first. That's the dynamic you normally see, and I would expect that to have quite a big input. But that said, we do have niche specialists that we just simply don't have here, and aren't really set up to train either necessarily. So I would expect there to be special exceptions for those very specialised workers.
Yeah, so in Singapore, obviously we know how reliant the country here is, relying on foreign workers, across all segments of society, from low-level construction workers all the way to highly skilled ones. I think what this will mean is it's very difficult for Singapore to wean itself off reliance on foreign workers. It's just impossible to do that overnight. But what it means is probably in future, you probably have more stringent screening and testing, and so migration flows, foreign workers will still be needed in this country, but in terms of screening them, and I think more importantly, I think what's happening now with the outbreak in the foreign worker dormitories means that a fundamental rethink about their housing conditions, etc., hopefully leading to sustained material improvement in their housing conditions, will be, I guess, hopefully one positive that will come out of this here in Singapore.
I agree. Now, a couple of questions, Sharon, on New Zealand house and property prices. What impact do you expect there to be on rural land prices?
Well, the agri sector's carrying on largely, but we saw a lot of downward pressure on dairy land prices already before this, and that's largely as a result of the changing regulatory landscape. The milk price actually looks quite reasonable, but essentially there's much tighter restrictions on what you can and can't do with your land now, and particularly more sensitive land. I think there's an opinion out there that won't be shared by necessarily everyone, but maybe that dairy has spread into areas that it really isn't sustainable environmentally in the long run, and the market will play a part in correcting that. So the market's been in stasis essentially for quite a long time. But there is a lot of debt out there, very unevenly distributed, but about a quarter of dairy farmers carrying a very, very heavy debt load. So if we did see a sharp fall in the dairy price than we are building in now, that could make life extremely difficult for those farmers. We haven't actually seen the New Zealand dollar fall out of bed, for example, and that's partly because in a relative sense we're looking pretty good, and we sell food. So actually our dollar's being pushed down by the sort of risk fear element, but that's receding, and our commodity prices are holding up better than others, and exchange rates are a relative game. So whereas in the GFC our exchange rate plummeted under 40, it's now actually holding up pretty well.
Okay, I'm just going to grab one more question here because I'm aware we're on time, and we'll wrap it up, and then maybe we can answer a few of the unanswered questions afterwards. Khoon, is one for you. Do you share Sharon's assessment that the equity markets are overpriced given potential corporate earnings impacts?
I gotta be careful here because we don't give investment advice. I think if you look at what's happening, if you consider that in Asia anyway, the current quarter they were in will fare worse than the first quarter. That suggests that the worst isn't over yet, and therefore, yes, the earnings, etc., is set to be materially a lot weaker than probably what analysts have already anticipating. So in that regard, I would say yes, the equity recovery that we've seen in recent weeks seems a little bit, I guess, premature. But then again, we are having unprecedented amounts of liquidity being unleashed by not only the US Federal Reserve, but also other central banks, and including in this region as well. I mean, don't forget, New Zealand is not the only new kid on the block to do quantitative easing. Some of the central banks in Asia as well have actually started to do quantitative easing for the first time. They don't call it QE, they call it something else, just like how Singapore doesn't call it lockdown, they call it circuit breaker, but it's same thing. So that liquidity ultimately will need to find its way somewhere. I think that's probably what is helping to prop up equity markets for the time being. Whether that can be sustained or not, I think ultimately depends on how bad can earnings get, how bad can the economic contraction get. My personal feeling is I think the rally probably got a little bit ahead of itself and might not be sustained for too long.
Okay, now look, we'll leave it there for today. Thank you both so much for your time on behalf of the New Zealand Chamber and the large number of attendees that we had today. Thanks both of you for your time and your expertise, even if it's not really information we want to hear right now. Look, we will make this recording available to everyone through the usual channels. Everyone who's attended this will get a copy of the recording. And yeah, look, we will also do our best to answer some of the questions that came in when they came in the name. So thank you both for your time today, and thanks everyone for attending.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.